Dear friends, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Natalia Popovich. I think most of you know me already, but just in case, I'm the chairperson of Ukraine House in Denmark, and it's my great pleasure to welcome a great friend for I don't know how many years,
30-something years.
For 30-something years. Yevhen Hlibovytskyi, who is truly one of the most known strategists for Ukraine. If countries have strategists, I would consider Yevhen to be one of the most prominent ones for Ukraine. He's the founder of the Promova consultancy and also the founder of Nestoriv Group, which has worked with the scenarios of future for Ukraine for a long time. And most recently, he has founded the Institute of Frontier, which I think is absolutely necessary for Ukraine to better grasp its role as a frontier of democracy, or as a frontier of freedom, or of many maybe senses that we will be discussing today with Yevhen. We both went to Kyiv Mohyla Academy. I remember coming to one of the first lectures of political science, and we had a sort of like a Q&A with our professor, and Yevhen, raised his hands. He stood up, and he challenged our political science professor, who, to most of us, felt like an extreme authority. No one was able to challenge him, and I always felt that this, Yevhen will always have something to say. So today we will hear what he has to say about a subject that we called Ukrainian model. Many of you know the Danish model now, and it's becoming more and more prominent. And I think Ukraine is extremely grateful to Denmark for initiating Danish model, which is a way to invest in Ukraine defense production, quite unique. It seems so simple, but it was the Danes who proposed it and for enacting it. And I think it plays an extremely important role in Ukraine's future security. But we're going to be talking about the Ukrainian model. And by Ukrainian model, I'll ask Yevhen to introduce his vision, his thinking behind it, of exactly how is it possible that Ukraine, I think, has surprised so many people around the world with, for the last 3 years, a full-scale invasion, for the last already since 2014, 11 years of war, this second largest army in the world, and a huge and authoritarian state that we are neighboring. How is it that we are still standing, and how is it that our institutions of quite young, newly emerged after the breakup of the Soviet Union democracy are standing? What role civil society plays, and what is unique about this model? So I'll ask you, Yevhen, to maybe start introducing to us, how do you envision this Ukrainian model?
All right. Thank you. First of all, thank you for this invitation. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for maintaining the interest in Ukrainian issues. I think it's important for all of us because we're actually coming close to understanding that it's not only about Ukraine, that it's not only about Ukraine's security, and it's not only about the Ukrainian people, but we're actually talking in broader senses about the security on the continent. We're talking about the probably a much riskier world that we're going into than I would personally like for my kids to inherit. But when we're talking in terms of models, there's a number of surprises that Natalia already talked about that came, especially in the beginning of full-scale invasion. And looking at the beginning of the big war, we can clearly see different optics that the world was looking at Ukraine through. The Russian optics, and I would say that it's probably shared by the Chinese, and it's probably shared by some of the Russian allies, is the optics that is overly quantitative. It sees numbers, and it's very focused on resources. So the key question is, how many people do you have? How many shells do you have? How many guns do you have? And based on that, there is a quantitative approach. Okay, we have more, so we will win. The Western approach is very institutional. So it's about structure, it's about delegation of authority, it's about ability to perform, it's about ability to create institutional links. And based on this, Ukraine also underperformed. This is definitely not the strongest point that Ukraine has. So we had a kind of strange situation when Putin actually put less force than he had to conquer Ukraine, because he thought that it's going to be an easy walk. Whereas the Pentagon and the others looking at Ukraine were also thinking that Ukraine is doomed and it won't survive. And Ukraine was actually, we were quite close to having very serious problems with defending Kiev. It was a narrow goal. But nonetheless, Ukraine has proved to be more resilient than everyone anticipated, both the Russians and the West. And from the Russian and from the West and the West. And from the Russian and from the Western perspective, this is kind of caused in 2022 a number of publications in different Western media, mostly by the scholars, saying, wait a second, are we talking about Ukraine as a flawed version of liberal democracy? Or is it actually a different governance model altogether? Are we talking about the model that we're used to, and it's been perceived that it's in Ukraine, it's very corrupt and imperfect, or we're actually talking about a different model of governance, and therefore the names of the institutions that are similar don't necessarily represent the same senses or the same descriptions that would be in our home countries. And this looked like an interesting issue to me. And this is exactly what is one of the things that I want to research within the Frontier Institute where I'm working. And this is the more I'm still operating hypotheses, and I'm still operating things that are in the process. But the closer I come to, the further I dwell into the matter, the more I come to conclusion that yes, there are more and more signs that Ukraine is at this point a different model. Doesn't necessarily mean that this model is sustainable, doesn't necessarily mean that this model is the model to be. It's probably a transitional model. We will probably end up in the same liberal democratic model as the rest of the developed world. But for the time being, this is not the way it works. And the two things that are quite different is, first things is that the state is not perceived as a service to the society. Actually, the state is perceived as potentially a villain. And this comes from difficult history of trauma that Ukraine has with the Soviet autocracy and totalitarianism. Totalitarian or close to it autocratic state lasted for over 3 generations in Ukraine, which does not allow a V-shaped recovery after that, unlike Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, where you can have the social competences that skip one generation and just go from grandparents to grandkids, skipping the middle generation. This is not the case in Ukraine. It's not possible. Totalitarian trauma makes the society very cautious of any strong authority. Therefore, the generalized Western advice that we had in the 90s, that you need strong rules, you need strong institutions, Ukrainians defied that because Ukrainians had strong rules and strong institutions. Technically, when millions of Ukrainians were killed, they were killed according to existing law at the time. So it wasn't fair, it wasn't just, but it was legal. And the idea that law can be unjust is the idea that it's very far from mainstream judicial practice in the West, but it's something that is very known in Ukraine. Therefore, one of the things that Ukrainians try to do as a society is to make sure that the government is never strong. The government should be weak. And I'm not talking about the Reaganist, narrative that, the government is somehow evil, etc. No, we're not talking left or right things. We're talking about the fear that once the government is unaccountable and there is no historical experience of accountability of the government, then the government starts killing people en masse, one way or the other. And what that creates, it creates a model under which you have a number of parallel institutions to the state. Because the society weakens, the state functions. They are not operating as efficiently as they could have. Therefore, the services, the society ends up being underserved. And to compensate for that, the society creates the civil society that with its services covers for the underserved government roles. And as a result, what we have is we have basically a system where you have the state that is weaker than usually, that is in many cases blocked by the society and is incapable, that has very weak model, very weak mandate. And a bit later, I will explain how exactly Ukrainians do that. But at the same time, they have complementing institutions in the civil society that actually cover for the losses. Financially, I wouldn't say that this is the most efficient way to do things, but this serves the purpose. This serves the society. And what it allows Ukrainians to have something that is incredibly important in the modern world, and that is probably the most important thing: resilience. That allows for the Ukrainian society to be resilient and to have ability to stand up to an aggressor, to stand up to a bully, to stand up to its own government in a long-term way, in a way that allows the survival of the society for years, decades, or even generations, which is very contrary to what we have in many European countries, where 4 generations of external security provision with condition that not even the full bill was covered by the society's security bill, created the perception of the security as a commodity. Security is just there. You don't have to do anything to be secure. Therefore, you can just go on with your life. And something like a Russian attack on this can have devastating consequences, because simply the societies would not be able to respond, would not be able to resist. Actually, the response to the increased expenditures on defense in many countries is actually voting for the parties that want to have their eyes shut in front of the busy intersection. And we see the AfD in Germany, we see France, we see how Tories are basically being dissolved by Reforms UK in Britain. So this is, these are all worrying signs, because they basically come from the idea that the Russians have found a weak spot inside the European culture, and they basically are pressing on that spot, saying that, look, you want not to be invaded, so behave. And then this blackmail is actually something that a lot of countries go for. And look at the recent NATO discussion where Spain was trying to object the expanded level of expenditures, government expenditures on defense? Yeah, because Spain thinks that it's far away. And probably in the 20th century it would have been, if not for cyber, if not for information, if not for artificial intelligence, if not for the electrical lines that are being cut off, if not for other things that are actually happening in Spain. It looks like the Nords and the Balts are actually those who have a more sober view of the threat that is coming. And therefore, there's a willingness greater willingness to see what can be done. But at the same time, whereas Ukraine is trying to integrate with the European Union, what it means that Ukraine has to harmonize its legislation with the EU legislation, and it has to rebuild its institutions along the EU template or templates. And in some cases, what the Ukrainian experts start to see that this actually harms the resilience. And what we see is that, probably nobody in this room and nobody in sober mind would still believe that NATO Article 5 is a given, under what we've gone through and under, the Estonian ship being taken over by the Russians. This basically means that the EU either has to face the consequences of not having the security umbrella over it anymore, or it has itself to transform itself into a security union. Well, if it's transforming into security union and it's trying to build up its resistance, then it basically means that the current European models do not provide the response to the question, how do you make the society more resilient? And how do you make the society more involved in the security matters? And that's exactly what we have in Ukraine. So this is the case where this Ukrainian model of involving the people in different ways through different institutions and building strong network that complements the hierarchy of the government is actually part of the solution to the common security threat that we experience in Europe.
In your work, can you comment a little bit more on how this evolution of Ukrainian civil society is happening? Because my view in terms of resilience and from the research of resilience, and I do these long studies of resilience of Ukrainian organizations over the last 5 years, and I see how even in the last 5 years, in the society, we begin to see bigger role of some actors. So, for example, 25 years ago and 20 years ago, and maybe even 15 years ago, business largely did not pay taxes in Ukraine because it was considered that the state is, if not evil, then ineffective, and why contribute to the Ukrainian state? With the pandemics, when all of a sudden the business understood that there are no hospitals where you can fly to, or with the war, when the business realized that we do need an army of some form, and maybe better if it's not a private army, but actually armed forces of Ukraine, there is this, kind of a trend that I see of a more responsible behavior of business in Ukraine. There is a peculiarities in that, and maybe you can talk about this a little bit too. Within the civil society, you're absolutely right. We saw this influx of organizations that appeared on the map in 2014, many of them volunteer-based, but many of them also very quickly becoming too dependent on donors and not really having the large kind of a membership base that is a true sign of a civil society organization that is part of the civil society. How do you see this evolution? Because these are major kind of underlying trends, I think, that will be defining not just how Ukraine performs eventually against Russia right now, but also what will define its future moving forward.
Well, I think it's all about involvement. So I think it's called participatory environment in the legal frameworks. But I think at the same time it's all about agency. Ukraine is an interesting exception from the majority of cases of countries that arise from colonial heritage. We usually know that if some identity, some nation is controlled by an empire, and that at a certain point the agency arises, the critical mass is gained, and then we have an overthrow, and that's how the new independent state comes to exist. In Ukraine, it didn't quite happen this way. There was a tiny short window of opportunity that I think lasted probably one day in 1991, when Ukraine could have, and Ukraine did become independent. But not because of the victory of the National Liberation Movement, but because of the incredible coincidence of interests of the National Liberation Movement, but also the ruling communist elites. The price for that was that the new independent country that happened basically inherited all these sins of the old system, and detachment of the society from the government was part of this. And then later we had a number of attempts to somehow close this gap, and eventually we did it through the decentralization reform, where one of the reasons why people didn't want to pay taxes was because they actually didn't want to give the government, who is not benevolent, the resources that potentially would mean that you will be persecuted through these resources. So the reform of decentralization basically took these worries away. So most of the taxes paid stay at the local level. Most of the decisions are made at the local level. And accountability is much easier to build on the local level. And this is probably one of the most important reforms that Ukraine has undertaken in the last 15 years. What it did, it basically put the society in, I would say, in pretty good coordination with the local authorities. But the problem stayed with the central government. And so now in many cases, what we have is the way it looks politically, it's the local authorities against local self-governance against the central government. That's how the conflict, for instance, is framed politically. But on the other hand, it's very interesting that the civil society model or model of civil society action is not inherent only to the civil society. In many cases, you cannot segregate the business activity from the civil society activity. So in many cases, civil society activity is basically integrated into the business models, and businesses themselves participate in many things that are not related to business. The number is a speculation, but we're talking about double-digit percentage of drones that fly in Ukraine that don't leave the paper trail. There is no paper trail behind this because they are either constructed in garages or they're constructed somewhere, in some cases even industrially, but they're in no way reflected in official statistics, because businesses basically believe that this is part of their obligation to do it, so they supply whatever they can, to the front line. And so this is kind of an interesting case where we have, for instance, the Ministry of Defense that is responsible for procurement of whatever we need for the war. But at the same time, there are huge, enormous foundations that are part of the civil society, like Come Back Alive.
Yeah, we just had a visit from
Сергій Притула, that operate tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. And they actually also do procurement, and they create competitive market for the government, because when the ministry actually procures something, everyone's looking whether they did it better or worse than these foundations, So in a sense, then the church is also working as a civil society. So I would say that in some cases, even the government officials sometimes work not along the government guidelines, but along the rather activist patterns. But what it does, it closes the gaps and it makes the system very resilient. It doesn't make it efficient, but it does make it resilient. And it makes the citizens very involved in the daily life of the country, which is probably the most important asset that Ukraine has and the most important contributing factor that we have to our ability to stand up to Russia.
I wanted to ask you about the revolution of dignity and the values. Sort of like if you were to redefine how important it was for the Ukrainian model to evolve as a civil society, and what values do you think are defining now how Ukrainian civil society operates as of right now, as of the year 2025? Because it's been an evolution since 1991 to today.
Life in Soviet Union is not far away from serfdom. If you're a human being in the Soviet Union, you don't have rights. You don't have, you're not a entity. You're a resource. You're a point of statistics, and therefore you have no agency. And basically, once the Soviet Union fell, there was a motion that was gaining its momentum ever since, where more and more people were coming to understand their agency and required that agency is respected. And it gained its critical mass in 2014, and we call these events the Revolution of Dignity, which basically says, okay, I'm a citizen, I have responsibilities, I also have rights, and I require everyone to treat me with a certain level of inherent dignity. And that means that no one can be, brushed aside, no one can be jailed without due process, no one can be persecuted, no one can be hurt, no one can be treated as a resource, and this basically meant a huge change in governance, because the government could not exercise its will without any restrictions anymore. And it made a lot of elites very uncomfortable because they had to change their ways of operation. As any young society in Ukrainians, you see, it's also kind of Ukrainian time is tricky because Ukraine is an ancient culture, but a very young country. And we have some things that are built in for centuries, but some things that only exist months. So as a young society, we still kind of calibrate where, how certain rights should be exercised, how certain obligations should be exercised. And there are very lively discussions, about this in, how we want to do it. And do we have to all go and join the army? Who should be exempted? Who should not be exempted? How do we pay our taxes? Are taxes high? Are taxes low? What do we do with bad governance? What do we do with malevolent influences in the army? What do we do with people not being treated right? All these questions are valid, and this is a very active environment in which we're trying to improve it. But at the same time, I would say that the civil society is the moving, it's the engine, and we're not used to having civil societies being the engine. In most countries in the West, it's the government. It has the delegated authority. And now what we see in the United States, and this is something that scares a hell lot of many Ukrainians, is the key question that Ukrainians have about the United States. Has the United States system fallen? Or is it just, taking its time before it will finally respond and the institutions will correct, the political course. And the impression that the Ukrainian society is having right now is that the Western models don't have the backups, whereas the Ukrainian model is backed up at every stage. So, if the official thing falls, then you have, a number of alternatives how you do things. Whereas if the official way, for instance, I don't know, military recruitment or military procurement or, I don't know, food supply fails in the country that is heavily reliant only on one system, can it survive? And the Western diplomats in Kiev, in frank conversations, say that they have the same worries about their own societies.
I think the roof of what you just said was that very often we hear how people are surprised that in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and started the war in the east of Ukraine, there were no refugee camps, even though 1.5 million Ukrainians somehow were dispersed in Ukraine. And the same with the war, like there are no, so the country has this strategic depth, someone would say, also in terms of its resilience to withstand that. But still, I just want to challenge you a little bit on the, you mentioned the religion, and obviously our faith and religious organizations play a very important role in civil society. Maybe you could comment on how big of a role they can play for the civil society. But also Archbishop Huzar used to say that, Ukrainians or people, next generation has to grow in freedom. Like, your diagnosis of the current stage of the Ukrainian societies, do you feel that Ukrainians have grown in freedom, or are we still, on one hand, enduring the war, tackling the aggressor, and at the same time are still countering the trauma of post-totalitarian state, the trauma, or not a trauma, just a history of, huge history, was kind of a Byzantine culture. Herzog, our historian, used to say that maybe it's going to take us a generation to sort of recoup ourselves from the Soviet, from a Soviet legacy, but it's going to take much longer, to get out from the kind of Byzantine type of framework in terms of governance and the ways in which society operates. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the things that really kind of surprising and interesting is that the closest partners that Ukraine has at the moment are the Nordic countries. Whereas Ukraine, by its nature, is a Mediterranean country with all the chaos that it involves and everything, it's the food is pretty good, but then on the negative side, you have a lot of governance and other issues. So in terms of north-south, comparison, I'd say that Ukraine is a very different animal to what we're used to in Scandinavian countries. It looks much more chaotic when you look at it probably through the northern lens. But at the same time, that part of that chaos is chaos, and we have to admit it. Part of that chaos is actually the order that we cannot crack, the order that we cannot explain. And that order actually means that there are multiple layers of this governance. And when we're talking about the church, I think that's important to explain. And I'm talking mostly when I'm talking about the church, I'm not talking about the spiritual side. I'm talking about the social effects that the church has on society. So I'm talking about the church as social institution. The unique thing about religious life in Ukraine is that Ukraine doesn't have a typical European religious landscape. Typical European religious landscape is one denomination or two denominations per country. So you have the vast majority of parishes that are one or two denominations, and then you can have some minority groups. When we're talking about Ukraine, we have three different Orthodox denominations, depending how you count, two different Catholic denominations. Then you have a number of Protestants, and some of them are pretty big. Some of them are number two in different places. Some are even number one. Then you have at least two avenues of Judaism. Then you have Sunni Muslims, Sufis are the indigenous Crimean Tatars, then the other Sunni Muslims, and then you have also Shia Muslim minorities. And what that does, it creates a very North American religious landscape where you have lots of different churches, lots of different groups. But at the same time, what it does, it creates a society that has many truths. And when it creates a society that has many truths, that means that your ethics and my ethics don't necessarily are not necessarily the same. So we have to align them somewhere within the country if we want to live together and be protected, be safe, and be comfortable. You know, when I go to when I do go shopping or when I go to my car mechanic, you know, I interact with people of religions that are different than mine, you know, and things like a job well done also has different meanings in many cases. And that's where we come to the point that we understand that being Ukrainian is not only or cannot only be limited to an ethnic definition. It's about the state. So we all need the state as an environment, as an ecosystem in which we exist. And we all, regardless of our ancestry, are protecting it. Now, in that state, we have the government, and the government is like a predator in that ecosystem that we still can't contain. You know, we are coming close to it, but we can't contain it fully. And we need that predator because that predator does a lot of functions that we need. But at the same time, it bites us. We're bleeding sometimes. Sometimes, we break our legs, trying to escape from it. But that ecosystem itself is of enormous value. And what you have in the end is multiple ways how you can serve your country, how you can serve your ecosystem. The diversity that we have, religious, ethnic, cultural, regional, institutional diversity that we have in Ukraine, and this is what people tell in the military a lot, is that you have a challenge and then you end up having tens of different ideas how you can deal with that challenge. Mm-hmm. So that fosters creative environment, that fosters innovation, that fosters ability to move very quickly. It's amazing, when we see the cycle of innovation, for instance, with the drones on the front line. We're talking about a matter of weeks, for the full cycle of innovations to pass. Whereas, for instance, in similar industrial conditions, for instance, in Germany, it usually takes 2-3 years, but at the same time, it requires, and this is something that Ukraine will eventually navigate to, it requires good legal system. And we're not there yet.
I still have one more question about the media, because I do need to ask the question. But I already saw raised hand. Was it in the? No. Oh, okay. You were stretching. Okay. All right. I do have to ask you about because you talked about the religion, the role of religious organizations and different aspects in these layers in the society. What is the role? What is the true role of public broadcaster in Ukraine right now? To what extent you feel that Suspilne is kind of living up to the maximum that it should be in a country that, as you mentioned, is still navigating towards its evolving social contract? Mm-hmm. What can be done for it to play that role? Because I'll say sort of why I'm framing this question, because everywhere here within the discussions of Nordic Defense Summit or Copenhagen Democracy Summit, everybody now is talking about, if you want to make your societies more resilient, do invest into your public broadcasters. Mm-hmm. You need to have them in. European public broadcasters probably have to grow as well, needless to say ours. So what's your view on that?
Well, I sit on the supervisory board of the Ukrainian public broadcaster, and that doesn't mean that I always like what I see with the Ukrainian public broadcaster, but let me put it this way. Usually the mission of the European public broadcaster is to bring to the audiences good quality of news, good quality of entertainment, and good quality of educational programming. And that's usually how the mission is. It, can be put in different words, but that's about, in a nutshell, that's what it is. Whereas the mission of the Ukrainian public service broadcaster starts with the word protect the rights in Ukraine, or protect the freedoms in Ukraine. Probably freedoms would be a more correct translation. And what it implies is that we exist in an institutionally weaker system where in many cases you must be heard because you cannot rely solely on the courts, for instance, to get the justice. So you sometimes have to make yourself heard to the society. So it's extremely important that we have the freedom of speech that allows us to know what's happening. And
explain this role of the court of public opinion.
Yeah. Court of public opinion is, for the better or for the worse, is extremely important. And that also why education is important, because if you have the court of uneducated public opinion, then you're in trouble. Or drunk public opinion, or otherwise manipulated public opinion. For instance, threatened public opinion, and that's what Russians do well. The public broadcaster it's actually interesting because no one wants it. The government doesn't want it. The political opposition, well, they say every time they're in the opposition that they want it, but then when they become the government, they don't want it. So they're trying to defund it, and they're trying to limit it to the, to the most, to the best of their ability. But public service broadcast has extremely good support from the grassroots, and this is what's important. And this is sociologist in me talking. The innovation that Ukrainian society did was to decouple popularity and trust. In most developed societies, things that are trusted are popular, and things that are popular are trusted. What happens in Ukraine is these two things are detached. So you can have something that is trusted, but not necessarily popular, or vice versa. For instance, Zelensky is extremely popular, but his trust levels are mostly negative when you measure the levels of trust. If you look at, or any institution in Ukraine, you have very few institutions that actually have positive balance of trust, whereas that is not correlated with the level of popularity. So we see this with public service broadcast very often. The public service broadcast has some unimpressive figures of viewership until the crisis happens. And that's the moment when everyone wants to really know what's going on, and that's when everyone, goes to the public service broadcast. And then, after a while, they go back to, to the more convenient, kind of more crispy news, as I would call it. So this is, I think, the Scandinavian countries are the only countries that really have this appreciation of public service broadcast. Also, probably the Brits. When we look, German, French public service broadcast is pretty strong, but when we go to other countries, we understand, for instance, Poland, it's basically dead. We look at many other countries, especially south of Europe, and we understand that it exists pro forma. It just technically it's there, but it's not really performing. So in that sense, we actually see that in many instances, Ukraine has the institutions that function above the EU average, and this is also very important. Especially that I would say that the public service broadcast was appearing as more of a guerrilla movement than it wasn't a top-down reform. It was a bottom-up reform because the government didn't want it. They get an extra policeman watching over them, and they don't like that. And so this is I think is very important. And the other thing is that because we are so different, in Ukraine because of enormous diversity that we have, cultural diversity, religious diversity that I talked about historically. We come from different, Ukraine is former part of three empires, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman. We share different assumptions. And there is an inherent feeling in every Ukrainian that you are a minority, even if you technically belong to the majority, because the rest of the majority is not like you. So you really have to protect the rights, because then the system will protect you. And if you're not protecting the rights, or if you're abusing the rights, then eventually it will come and bite you. So this feeling of vulnerability, I think it actually serves to the common benefit of the entire society.
To what extent is Suspilne successful in slowly but surely, especially in terms of its educational role, of kind of taking Ukrainians on this journey from Homo Sovieticus for many to modern Ukrainian citizen, understanding, as you said, their rights, but also responsibilities for the state. Is it really working? Because I think the best test for a mature, broadcasting service, but not only, obviously, but test for the society, is good leadership, good governance. And as you rightly said, in the south of Europe, we also see many more problems than in the Nordics with this. And how does that also influence this connect with the political model? Because as we know, in Ukraine, we still have largely, political parties that are not defined by certain ideologies or well understood by anybody principles, more like
I think we went ahead of the populists and we started doing that.
They're led by personalities and bank accounts, or rather more than by certain consensus with their even their own voters. So the question, I guess, both about, to what extent Suspilne is playing that role and how successful it is in kind of educating, but also for the future, sort of how do you see the strengths of this Ukrainian model of civil society translating it into, better political?
Well, let me give you a few examples just to understand how it all works. Suspilne, just like any other media, complies with national security limitations that we have. These are usually direct and very specific recommendations that the government issues, and then we follow them. But in editorial policy, Suspilne stays independent. And I'm one of the people who basically guards that independence. Suspilne was the public service broadcaster, was the one that aired actually the story about corruption in the Ministry of Defense. It was not well received even in the society, because many people said that, well, we shouldn't be talking about stuff like that during the war. The stand that the public broadcasters took was that if we do not tell the truth, then we will end up in a worse situation than if we tell the truth that is unpopular. And there was a lot of quarrel about this, but so Suspilne airs critical stories to the government. I think we are the only ones who really have very well balanced political representation in the news and in the information programming. All the others have their favorites. And sometimes favorites to the extent that it's basically a construction of virtual reality that has nothing to do with the real reality. And also it's important that public service broadcast is part of this security bubble that, for instance, parents can rely on vis-a-vis the kids. I'm not sure if this is the case that you have in the society like the Danish society, but what happens in Ukraine right now is that the Russian propaganda basically penetrates the children through social networks and forces the children who cannot be accountable of their actions to do terrorist attacks or do other covert attacks. and the kids actually don't really understand what they're doing. From their point, it's gamified. It's they're just doing something cool. They don't necessarily understand that they're doing this for the Russians. So for the parents, it's extremely important that they have a safety zone, information safety zone for their kids. And that's where the public broadcasters come in. The types of challenges that we come in, right now are the types that in some cases are kind of hard to believe, when we actually uncover this web, and how it's penetrated us and how the cognitive warfare actually plays out. And so this is in many cases kind of hard to believe how sophisticated the system that we're up against is. But at the same time, we understand that if you do it right, if you follow the mission, if you follow the rules, if you have good governance, and quality of governance is extremely important. And we've been very lucky with good leaders, but at the same time with good system. And we're constantly upgrading the system, changing it and improving the rules. Then the things are working, and we've had situations where very recently, when things that would have ended up with a crisis 5 or 6 years ago, we were fine. We just, skipped those challenges now. So, speaking of this is the point that I would like to emphasize, because as Ukraine joins the EU, the game right now is the way it's structured is that there's an EU that has the model, and then there's Ukraine that doesn't have the model or has the inferior model. And Ukraine basically has a list of reforms that it has to check and that it has to perform. What we see that in some cases, and that, by the way, includes public service broadcast, actually the European way means that we see that the European way actually either has the standard that is lower than the Ukrainian standard, or does not take into consideration the security factors. And we would actually need, for the benefit of both Ukraine and the European Union, to rather stick to Ukrainian standard, not the European standard. And this is the point where we have to do two things. And I think we're not we're not really considering this at this point, at least not the European Commission and not the Ukrainian government, but the civil society in Ukraine for sure, and some of the experts for sure, is that for the benefit of ourselves, it would be to review the way we conduct negotiations with the EU, change the rules, and make sure that this is the mutual integration, not a one-way street. Because if it's a one-way street, then Ukraine will become weaker. And I don't think that EU needs a weaker Ukraine in the Union. Ukraine actually is bringing its strength for the benefit of the Union. And I think if we want the Union to prosper, then it's important that we also take the positive experience that we see from Ukraine as a lab, as a potential, solution, and then implement it elsewhere to the benefit of the societies. I'm afraid that protecting ourselves in 21st century will take away us as societies away from the comfort zone. We've over-consumed the benefits in previous years or previous decades or previous generations to the point that now this generation will have to pick up the bill. And in order not to deepen the problem, we would have to learn to live along the stricter rules. And I can't believe that I'm a Ukrainian coming to Denmark to bring this message, because usually it's vice versa. So, but this is really the case. We will have to watch out. We will have to be wary of various threats, be that AI, that unfortunately now we're not in a condition to put any ethical restraints upon AI or machine learning. Next year, what the Ukrainian command is saying is that the next year, the machines will be more efficient than the humans in targeting on the front line. What it means that you can basically make a killing perpetuum mobile, that will be going around and just spreading death without human presence. And if there is no way to stop it, we might end up in terrible, terrible circumstances. Then the climate change, then the challenge to democracies and other systems that actually can abuse human rights and shrink the space for the freedoms that we enjoyed. If we don't wake up right now, we may end up in a disastrous 21st century. And looking how the unity has been targeted in security sector and how basically that dissolved NATO, looking how unity is being under attack in the EU. Look at the elections we just had in Romania. It was a close call. In Poland, in Germany, in France, in UK is out already. So we're up to a particularly difficult set of circumstances ahead of us, and it's important for us not to drop the ball, and it's important for us not to fall into the situation where we will need greater resilience that we will have nowhere to take from. And that's the Ukrainian, I would say, the Ukrainian you would say, conclusion probably, out of the story of Ukraine.
I think you mentioned in a very right way, sort of synchronizing the expectations of each other, which is important, I think, in this Ukraine-EU relations, bilateral and union versus, union and Ukraine. My question is about how do you feel Ukrainian society right now sees itself as a sort of a equal footing partner or not? Why I'm asking this question is because there are a lot of discussions, not just in the Nordics. In the Nordics, actually less so, because I do think that the Nordic countries predominantly see huge value in Ukraine, and by Ukraine I mean Ukrainians. So meaning that the Nordic countries, I think, on a majority scale, understand that we all need to make sure that as many millions Ukrainians survive as possible. But when you go, the further you go from Ukraine towards sort of other regions of Europe, that notion is not equally spread, I would say. Mm-hmm. So there will be places where you can hear something like, Ukraine is buying us time. Mm-hmm. NATO is going to attack us in 5 years. We will be ready by then. But for the time being, Ukrainians are doing a good job. Mm-hmm. And to what extent you feel the society at home mm-hmm. understands that notion that Ukraine has to be saved, or the lives of the millions of people have to be saved, or at least the million very competent Ukrainian soldiers' lives need to be saved as a shield for everybody else. To what extent that's one, and then it kind of brings me to my maybe final question, and I do hope to open this up to the questions from the floor. To what extent do you feel that then the notion of victory or the notion of end of war is synchronized between what Ukrainian society aspires to right now and what EU aspires to?
They're not synchronized, for sure.
How different are they?
I think they live on different planets. Russia has to be defeated from the Ukrainian point of view for the benefit of the Russians and for the benefit of everyone else around. I think several things that are okay. Now, this is going to be a response with bad news. Okay. So the bad news is that we do not agree with basic assumptions. And basic assumptions is we do not agree what an empire is. The Western definition is that it's a sea empire. the definition that we're using is that it's mostly a land empire. And land empires work differently than sea empires. Land empires colonize not only their neighbors, but also their own population. They work differently. It's a different type of animal. We have a lot of those left. This is not, we're often talking in Western discourse that, Russia is the last empire. No, Russia is not. China, India, there are many more. But then the other thing is that when we see how these empires work, is they basically set a certain value on certain identities or on certain people, and foreign people or people who have been colonized are of lesser value, and their human rights don't particularly count that much. To begin with, we can say that their own population rights don't necessarily count much, for much. But this is the problem. We see that there is no way that Ukraine can win by just restoring its territorial integrity. The threat will stay. And if the threat will stay, then it's not much of a victory from Ukrainian standpoint, because basically what it means is, a generation away, it's going to be a new war. We don't feel it right now. We don't. Then the Russians will keep on living in misery. This is a country that has gone through tremendous religious an ethical transformation, basically, coming to the culture that has the cult of death in the society, and that, if we go back to what Sting was singing, Russians love their children too. Well, not necessarily, and the notion of love or definition of love would be very different. And the other thing is that the Ukrainian resilience is very often taken for granted in the West, and it comes at a price. And let me tell you the price that it comes with. First is politically, we notice that the center is being washed out in Ukraine as we go. And every additional year of war of attrition, fewer and fewer Ukrainians stay committed to centrist voting, which means Ukrainians will vote radical, more radical than they used to. Ukrainians did not like radicalism. All of the Ukrainian nationalists got together in one bloc for the parliamentary elections of 2019, and they ended up with glorious 2%. I think Denmark beats us, but I don't think that's going to be the case any longer. And the other thing is that Ukrainians discover their dark side, and it's inevitable, because in certain cases you have to go beyond what human nature can bear. You're going into, I would say, something that is widely described in Ukrainian literature that can probably be translated as post-death, where you're dead inside, but you are still living, and you still carry on what you have to do. But in this condition, you no longer feel the pain, you're no longer empathic. And a lot of people like that will be joining the Ukrainian society after the war, not on the battlefields, but in peaceful life. And they will be with us. And we've put them through that misery, partially because we did not want to help them in time with arms. We did not want to help them in time with resources. We did not want to help them in time with commitments, political commitments, even though these commitments in many cases were largely symbolic. And the same thing is happening to the civilians. One of the benefits of me being here, not in Kiev, is I can sleep well. Finally, I can have a good sleep, even though the hotel mattress is terrible. But, I have a good mattress at home. But, every evening around 11 p.m., the first air siren goes on. then the drones come in, then the ballistic missiles come in, then the drones come in again, and then you wake up and you go to work. You didn't go to sleep, but you go to work, and eventually it wears you out, and the Russians are claiming that they can do it endlessly, and Ukrainians cannot hit their production facilities. So Ukrainians asked for German Taurus missiles or asked for other American missiles so we can hit their facilities. We never got a positive answer. So what happened? Ukrainians started innovating. The result of the recent innovation is that no strategic facility is now safe. What Ukrainians did, they smuggled the drones to the close vicinity in containers, in cargo containers. Pretty much any cargo container anywhere, and this is the nation that has Maersk, can contain anything as of now. There is no security as we understand it, strategic security anymore as we understand it in previous generations. And I'm afraid that we will have difficulty helping the veterans to come to terms with them feeling that they were hostage both by the Ukrainian society and by the Western partners, not willing to take part of the responsibility, and just being slowly killed one after the other on the front line because we enjoy the comfort here while the people there are dying. And I'm not trying to shame anyone into or guilt anyone into anything. This is not about guilt or shame. I'd say this is about very pragmatic conversation. Ukrainians are extremely grateful for every assistance, for every euro, every dollar, I am indebted to the Danish nation because actually the reason I'm here, I came here for the graduation, my daughter graduation from the university, and the Danish taxpayer picked up the bill. And I'm very grateful to the Danish taxpayer, and I feel myself obligated to do the same and pay forward, pay for someone's education from another country who will be in need of this. But the message that I want to bring across is that if we continue this way, this is not going to end well. And the way it's going to end then, it will be that some of those who have protected us and who have granted us time, who have granted us comfort, will be so hurt that they themselves will turn into someone who will be looking for their private revenge, their personal understanding of fairness. And Ukraine has contributed tremendously to the international security by giving away the nuclear arms. Most of the Ukrainian society thinks it was a huge mistake. I'm now in minority. I think we did the right thing. I think the problem was that the Russians were not stripped of their nuclear arms. But I think we did the right thing. But I'm in a minority now. And if we don't do it fairly, and doing it fairly means that, for instance, the American society or the European societies generally don't admit that part of their prosperity and part of their quality of life came from the decision that the Ukrainians made in 1990s and now are being punished for that decision. And in that sense, Tucker Carlson says that the US doesn't bear any historical responsibility before Ukraine. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Very similarly to how NATO members bear historical responsibility before Ukraine for not allowing Ukraine to get membership action plan in Bucharest, for not allowing Ukraine to get protection that Ukraine needed in 2014 when Crimea was annexed. And Ukraine is on a crossroads. The Boeing that flew from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur flew over Ukraine. Ukraine is on a crossroads. These are flatlands. So what we've learned from our history is that we always have to be alert if we want to protect ourselves. But when you have a union that claims equality of the partners, and then some partners are always alert and some are not, then that union will be a house divided against itself, and it will not stand. So, surprisingly, we were mentored, rightly so, about Copenhagen criteria. And now we're mirroring the same message, and it doesn't come across. At least, a lot of political elites are deaf to it. We often can't penetrate political elites, or we can't penetrate the societies. And, this is our common area. Or then we should not claim that we treat all people equal, or that we let's just say, okay, we're hypocritical to this point, and then people with other color of skin or people of other origin are not as valuable as we are, and then at least it will be honest. So in that sense, I would say that there's incredible value and there's incredible gratefulness in Ukraine for the Danish model. There's incredible gratefulness for the resources and for the investments. This is incredible. We're doing it all for ourselves, and this is not enough.
Yes, I think I would love to take some questions from the floor. Katerina, and then Kirsten.
Yeah.
Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself and?
Thank you very much for your perspective. My name is Katerina Christiansen. I'm living here. I'm Ukrainian, but came here before. I'm just quite open when I'm talking with foreigners. I hear this kind of bitterness towards Russians, Russian civil society, that, kind of like Putin is a bad guy, and Russians are very scared, and they're intimidated, and they cannot protest against the government. And sometimes they're scared for their lives. On the other hand, I'm thinking about our lives, Ukrainians. Back in 2013-14, I was scared so much to come back home from Maidan, and also my friends. And but the thought to live in dictatorship was scarier for me. And I'm thinking, was it really easier for us Ukrainians back then than for Russians right now?
I feel a lot of resentment in your question, and this is I hear more and more of this because Ukrainian society is coming through enormous pains, and at the same time we don't achieve the understanding that it's not Putin's war, or it's not only Putin, or it's not only the system in Russia. Now, the problem is that we have to deal with deeply engraved and deeply shared and widely shared imperialist culture in Russia that is that has the support of majority of the Russian population. That doesn't necessarily mean that the war has the support of the majority of the Russian population. That's where we have different figures, but definitely the imperial sentiment. That means that other nations should serve Russia, and they don't have their agency, they don't have their dignity, they don't have their rights, they don't have their identities to be protected. That's the Russian way of doing things at the moment. Now, the problem with the Russian opposition, of the so-called good Russians, is that they mostly share the same sentiment. My good friend Vladimir Karamurza, who was I was very relieved when he was set free and when he could travel to the West. But he has, and I asked himself personally many times, he could never condemn Russian imperialism. I asked him, I confronted him directly with this question: could you publicly condemn Russian imperialism? Nope, he can't. Yulia Navalnaya, who is the wife of the surviving widow of Alexei Navalny, is the same way. Actually, from the Ukrainian point of view, Navalny was more dangerous than Putin. Putin is someone who doesn't use internet, who doesn't really read a lot, who makes stupid decisions. Navalny shares the same sentiment, but he was way more efficient. So the failure, the Western failure to actually treat people as equal and see the threats to the universal human rights and see the threats to the things that we signed up to when we, created the UN Charter, when, the fundamental European Union documents were signed, going all the way from Schuman to Copenhagen criteria and further, into the modern EU legislation. This asks the question: do we really understand what's happening? And from Ukrainian perspective, and this is where there's a risk of eventually resentment being sowed widely in Ukraine, is the West doesn't get it. So, if the West is ignorant of us, and if the West doesn't get it, and we are the ones dying, and they are fatigued, why should we care about them? So I can see potentially a rise of the movement that is very Orban looking, that is extremely selfish, that is very anti-European in its nature, in Ukraine. And then when it hits Ukraine, that's going to be Hungary on steroids. That's not good. That's not good for anyone. That's not good for Ukraine. That's not good for Europe. No one's going to win in this situation. So I think the formula that we right now have from the West is too little, too late. And I think it's time to wake up, and I think it's time to start actually making up for the lost time. We could have ended this war in 22, having sufficient arms. We missed that point. Now this war in a completely different technological age. This is now the war of drones. It's not easy to end the war of drones. Let me give you one small example. Imagine there is a truce. Imagine there is a ceasefire. How do you identify which drone from which side has actually broken the ceasefire? You can't. Let me translate it. There will be no ceasefires. And that we are coming into a way more dangerous world. But it's so easy to just continue living, as I would say, along the US movie, Don't Look Up, not looking up, let's just continue living as we lived, and it's going to be all right somehow. It's not. It's not. We see in Ukraine that it's not going to be all right. And at the same time, we're extremely vulnerable. We can have our businesses, our jobs, our lifestyle, our ability to fill the tank of the car, etc., because the EU is currently covering the entire budget of the Ukrainian state, because all the money that Ukrainian taxpayers are paying are going into the arms and more. Because beyond what Ukrainians are paying in taxes, Ukrainians are also contributing tremendous amounts of their own money, to the war effort. At the same time, all the pensions, all the salaries, all the state salaries, all the expenditures for education, etc., is being covered at this time mostly by European taxpayers. So mostly by you. This is incredible gift. This is a very generous gift. But we are not in this war only for ourselves, and that's important to remember.
We had a question here.
Hi, my name is Alexandra. Thank you for the insights. I have two questions. One is brief and maybe a bit rhetorical. what would you consider an appropriate reaction to someone saying that Ukrainians are not grateful enough to the people providing aid to them, and asking, have we ever thanked once? And the other one comes back to your earlier discussion about how the motivation to keep the government weak and to bypass it but still get your service, access to the service, does the same mechanism that creates a civil society in this case also create more corruption? And if it does, if it is connected, then how do you tackle one without necessarily suppressing the other in this transition to liberal democracy, as you said, is inevitable for Ukrainian model as well?
Okay, I hope it's inevitable. Let me start with the second question. I think we're kind of poisoned by this corruption discourse. Part of what the Russian propaganda was saying was that Ukrainians are incapable of governing themselves, that Ukraine is not really a country, that Ukrainians are not capable, etc., etc., etc. And part of this was about corruption. And Ukraine has incredible corruption in the government and in the state structures that were actually, as I said from the beginning, part of the remaining Soviet legacy. When we look at the corruption monitoring, we see that there is significantly less corruption in local self-governance. And this is already the new type of governance that we have. And the other thing is that while we were poking, and rightly so, at Ukrainian corruption, we forgot how the Russians got under the skin of the German government, for instance, with Nord Stream 2. We forgot, the sweet deals that the Russians had in France. We forgot, the gas deals that the Russians had in Austria and in other countries. Apparently, some of the things that were corruption in the EU didn't register as corruption, And so this calls for the question, let's demythologize corruption and look at more attentively at it. There is a historical problem that we have with corruption in Ukraine, and part of this is totalitarian trauma. The basic assumption in the West is that corruption defeats the purpose of the governance, which is the service that the society requires for its own existence. If you've gone through 3 generations of totalitarianism, one of the things that you know is that the rule, if the rule is not just, if the law is not just, but it's absolutely strong, then corruption becomes the ultimate security tool. Then corruption is your only chance of survival. That's when you get the family gold and give it to the police officer and tell, when they try to deport you to Siberia, and you tell them, just set the kids free. Tell that they were not at home. And these are the family stories that pretty much every Ukrainian shares. Corruption is a problem, and we have to understand which tools actually serve the purpose. In Ukraine, tool number 1 to improve the corruption situation is security. But the US administration didn't want to hear that response in 2014 because they were so afraid of escalation. In a sense, Obama and Trump have been equally ignorant about security issues, and Biden himself as well. And he turned out to be a terrible president for the Ukrainian existence, even though he was the one who actually signed a lot of the support, etc. And that's for the question of greatness. Are Ukrainians grateful for that? Yes. Who was the adult in the room when the Budapest Memorandum was created? That's a rhetorical question now. My personal response is, I always tend to, hope that people are good in their nature, and if I don't like something, I'll just pray for them, But this is not how it works in international politics. So at this point, the message that Ukrainian society is getting is that we should, in a sense, become similar to Israel. Think of your own interest before you think of interest of everyone else. Do the things that are important for your survival, no matter what. I don't like zero-sum game. That's not good for everyone, But if the EU or if the NATO is playing zero-sum game with Ukraine, what can Ukraine do in response? And I'm really afraid that Ukraine eventually might be in a position where it would have to consume a poison pill by radicalizing itself just to survive. I don't think any radicalization has helped the world to become a better place. Look at what happened with enabling mafia in Italy by the Allies during the Second World War. How many years did Italy suffer after that? We are close to committing serious strategic mistakes in Ukraine right now, internationally. But that's not going to be the problem of the people who didn't make the decisions or made wrong decisions, because they'll be enjoying their retirement. That's going to be the next generation of politicians. They will be solving that. And if it's not in your backyard, who cares? This is the war in Ukraine is a test to our own belief that we are holistic, that we have integrity, and we are failing this test at this point. So are we grateful? Yes. Is this enough? No.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Philip. I represent many different civil society organizations and just creating a new one to bridge between civil societies in Denmark and in Ukraine. My question goes a bit back to your definitions. It's something I often discuss with my political friends in Ukraine. What's the definition of civil society? Where I come from, or in Denmark, civil society ranked third. So you have the state with the definition, and then you have the market or the businesses, and then civil society is allowed to fill those gaps, and it's nice to have scouts and so on. But to me, civil society has 2 points. It is where people live their lives. So it has dignity within itself. This comes from Emmanuel Monet and definitions from personalism. That is not that widely spread here, but I think it's very important. So that's one point. And another point is that this is where democracy and trust is thought. I used to work for the Danish Youth Council, where this is something we have worked with since the Second World War in youth organizations. So it's very important that what we define as the small d, in opposite to the big D. The big D is voting, it's all we know, it's politicians, but the small d is in family life, in schools, and so on. So in this perspective, I'm so glad to hear that you say that civil society is the driving force. But then you said often you see it connected with businesses. And I see this in Ukraine too, that big entities is then the driving force. Could you elaborate a little more about I wouldn't call it a danger, because this is maybe necessary now, but maybe advise me as a Dane who want to help civil society in Ukraine. How do we at one time help and serve, and at the same time put into the point that democratic values is learned in those organizations? And it may take a bit longer. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I remember the international world values map, and we come from extreme ends, because where Ukrainian society is, it's survival, and then with survival the way it works in the survival cultures is anything works for survival. So, if business can help, so great. If something else can help, great. It's a more zero-sum game based ethics, and this is why I'm saying that it's important to protect positive-sum game, because if we go into the game theory, you cannot sustain positive-sum game if there is no security for the actors. So, and there is no security for the actors in Ukraine, so they tend to be zero-sum game driven. And that is an environment that calls for abuse. That's an environment that calls for mismanagement, and etc. Now, one of the reasons why dealing between the cooperation between the businesses and civil society in Ukraine has been so fruitful is because Ukraine doesn't have a stock market. So we don't have corporate bodies. A lot of Danish economy is corporations. We don't have corporations. Even big businesses in Ukraine are private. And because they are private, the way they're managed is through the will of the owner, not through the representative body of people who take more risk-averse approach, and who are trying to also consider the way it's going to reflect on the stock markets, etc. So you have much more leadership in business decisions in Ukraine. That also means that you have a lot more altruism in decisions. Some of the businesses do certain things not because it helps their business, but because the owners think that's right. Because the owners plan to continue to live in the same country, because the owner wants their kids to be successful in their country. So in a sense, lack of institutional development of the economy, where we ended up without the stock market, and therefore we couldn't corporatize our private economy field. In a sense, it helped us at this point. What it means for the corporate side is that it's important not to create the companies that are not accountable to society in no way. Because if we do them, that's what happened on Wall Street many times, etc. That's when you have the bodies that basically become extra tax on the society. And we've seen that through a number of regulations. For instance, in the I think the United States is a good case for that. But also Russia is a good case for that. Look, it's not even about strengthening the Russians. It's about the cronies making enough money. And this is, by the way, the greatest weakness of Russia that we have not exploited. These people will not use nuclear. They're hedonists. They want to enjoy the wealth. They want to enjoy the sex. They want to enjoy whatever is, the nature, or they just want to enjoy it for themselves only. But that means that they're afraid to lose life, and that means that they're afraid to lose their privileges. That's why they will not escalate. That's also something that I'm sorry being so ignorant and undereducated and understanding in these matters more than some of the people who are hired and being professionally trained to do this. And this is, by the way, this is the kind of the rift that Ukrainians feel. And this is where Ukrainians say, okay, well, NATO, what NATO? There is no NATO. There is no Article 5 guarantee, not with Trump in the White House. That's it. This is the end, and we have to admit it and move forward. Now we are closer to having the NB8 and plus Ukraine as a potential platform for the military alliance in the future. I hope it won't have to come to this, because it's going to be a weak alliance. It's much better to have Germany and France and Britain on board, and hopefully the entire rest of the European Union. But bummer, we forgot to have a provision to exclude the countries from the European Union in case they lose democracy and in case they go, in the wrong direction. So now the Hungarian government, the Slovak government, and potentially being joined by other governments, think that they are entitled to their veto right, acting on behalf of Russia or on behalf of their own greed, for their own interest, and making everyone else weaker. And so we have to address the ethical questions, and we have to address the questions of common security. It's much cheaper to have common security than to have security of our own in many instances. And we would have to also think how we think of these connections between different institutions. Some of the things that business is doing in Ukraine right now came as a surprise to me. I didn't expect the civil society to be as resilient as this. We are learning about ourselves more than we ever knew about ourselves. But I'm disappointed, for instance, with how the church handled the strategic agenda. They've done pretty well in terms of servicing people, but they did not do well with agenda setting. So some of the institutions overperformed, some underperformed, and we're just learning on the fly, how it all connects. So in my understanding, Ukraine is a lab. I'm not claiming that Ukraine should develop a Ukrainian model to spread it everywhere. That's not going to work. But I would say that Ukraine is worth following attentively and taking notes for each respective country to see ideas and to see dead ends that have been explored before we walked into them, for the benefit of those countries.
Maybe just to follow up before we pass to another question. I'm not sure where you're coming from on this, but for me, knowing already the Nordic understanding of the society, not of philanthropy, but of society of welfare, Ukraine is not yet the society of welfare. It is a little bit still the society of philanthropy because of the role that business decides to play. And I think it's a question of maturity. And I think in the business, you need to differentiate. Like if you're asking, like, how could it be helped to differentiate? The oligarchic businesses are in a very different position because they've acquired their wealth by basically exploiting Ukrainian state and its deficiencies of the last 30 years. So they may have huge charitable foundations right now, but by Ukrainians, they will be perceived sort of like just paying their dues because they've kind of not stolen, but acquired so much from Ukraine in this time. At the same time, there is a growing trend among the middle-sized, mid-sized to small businesses that are understanding the importance of not being the charitable donators to Ukraine, but actually paying taxes first and then maybe doing additionally philanthropy, like Yevhen has mentioned. So there are already companies that do both, pay taxes plus do donations. This is the right way to do it. But there are still some who will talk about how much they've paid in terms of donations. But if you ask the question, for how many years have you been paying taxes, or, does your tax base correlate with the size of your business? There will still be differences.
Oh, could I just?
Yeah, and then go ahead.
Yeah. Just want to add on top of this, some of the things that Ukraine has done are kind of, they came out of blue. So we don't understand how that happened. Let me give you an example. A lot of Western household brands used to have back offices in Ukraine that would do, for instance, software for these brands. And these are the brands that we use every day. These are the brands that are well known. And so what happened in 2022? Most of these companies cut ties with the Ukrainian back offices. They were usually structured as independent companies that had only one client. So they just severed the ties. Before that, they mostly offered kind of best employees. If they want to evacuate, they would evacuate. But most of these companies stayed, and most of their personnel stayed. So these companies had the know-how, and they had the management structure, which was efficient. They were not known. They were not designed to be known, but they had the capacity. So what the Ukrainian government realized at that point was that if it wants to efficiently counter the deficit of arms and the Russian advantages, then we have to let the private entities into the military production. So a lot of Miltech came from household brands that used to have back offices. These back offices retained their ability, but they just changed the nature of the product that they were producing. And they were, because the way they were structured, because the way they were working, they were able to do it very fast. Within 3, 5, 6, 7 months, they were already capable of delivering some of the products. And this is where the breakthroughs come in, because we had enormous talent. And we're talking about tens of thousands of people working for, these companies, and there were probably hundreds of these companies. And now they are the backbone of the Miltech, for better or for worse. One of the owners of this company is a good friend of mine. He's telling me that he has nightmares because he understands that the arms that they develop help protect Ukraine, but one day they will be also used to kill innocent people. And he understands that he's developing this technology, and so this is there is probably the greatest, the most important part of the thing that I'm trying to convey is that there is price in not taking the decisions or not taking the decisions early enough.
My name is Gor, and I am program manager for Ukraine and also head of our representative office in Kyiv, international media support. My question is a bit on propaganda and information integrity, but mostly looking at how we work in the region, and also right now even focusing on Moldova. But my question is more of what do you think? I mean, we have, of course, the well-known actor on propaganda coming from Russia. We are more or less prepared, kind of expecting this, and the society more or less expects the Russian propaganda, so it's being spoken about. So my question is, which I've been myself thinking a lot, what do you think about American propaganda and the role of American propaganda in Ukraine, their influence in Ukraine now and possibly future, if we talk about at some point elections, because we see in one actor which is more clear, and another one with whom I believe never had interests of a united European Union, and with Ukraine being a candidate state, also at some point will join European Union. So my question is, what do you think about influence from the US? Of course, with Trump, but not only.
Well, okay. Well, Ukraine is kind of better insulated against propaganda simply because Ukraine is a low trust society. So Ukrainians they try to err on the side of caution, so they try not to trust, period. Those who have trusted didn't make it through the 20th century. They died. So taking any information that comes from any source with a grain of salt is something that has worked well for Ukrainians so far. That doesn't mean that Ukrainians are not prone to Russian propaganda, that Ukrainians are prone to Russian propaganda. Ukrainians are not. Ukrainians are consuming huge amounts of Russian content. Telegram is a problem. It's a social network with enormous manipulative capacity, and TikTok, it's global. So I'm not sure. Are you talking about the tech influence of the US? You're talking probably about Meta and others?
Both.
Both? Okay.
Both
Well,
political.
okay. Political.
You mean like anti-European context?
I'd say that you see the Russian propaganda is in university, and the American propaganda, if we're talking about political, it's in elementary school. So just to compare. But when we're talking about the tech sector, that's where the problem is. Ukrainian voices are silenced by the formula on Twitter, now X. So if you use word Ukraine, your tweet will not have the coverage, will not have the reach that the tweet without this word would have. It's programmed into the machine. We have a lot of question towards the quality of content policies on Facebook. And the office and the Ukrainian representative is flooded with complaints. And a lot of these complaints are never really looked at. So it's a good question whether nations should regulate the social networks. Because what the social networks have done to all of us, they have destroyed the common square. We no longer can all talk to it. We are now in the bubbles. And we can't sustain democracy, or we have to change institutionally our democratic model, or we have to be aware of this effect that the change in information consumption has on all of us. So politically, whether I like or dislike the particular U.S. government doesn't matter. Their propaganda is so blunt that you can, it drops with words that. But when we are talking about the tech influence, and I was always thinking that if I have to choose the platforms between IT platforms, for instance, for email client, or anything. Okay, well, most of the available and easily accessible ones are American. So well, do I care if the CIA reads me? Probably not. Well, now I have to rethink that, And but that's also the problem. That's not only the problem of the state. That's also the problem that basically, let's ask ourselves: is the U.S. still Western power? And I think we're gonna be up to very creative decisions in the future if we want to survive with the quality of life that we have. I'm joking to my Canadian friends that we're going to be in the same basket joining the EU. But that's actually something that we have to consider. We have to think out of box at this point, and we have to protect ourselves, even though it looks sometimes that something is benevolent, and it's actually not, as in case of, for instance, many social networks. IT technicians are telling me that you can't really get rid of it by just blocking it. It's a much more sophisticated story, and it's in Ukraine, for instance, the Ukrainian military, the easiest way for them to communicate among themselves is Telegram. That's just crazy,
Not a signal.
Just
Nope.
Just a short remark on that, because this is something I'm sitting and working, and also with Denmark being a president of EU from July, we are also planning a global conference on information integrity in November here in Copenhagen. And one of the things and focuses is actually alternative social platforms. And this is something that I've been discussing in Brussels a couple of weeks ago with several civil society actors, as well as the European Commission. What is our role as European states looking into that? I know this sounds ridiculous now. When I've heard it first time a year ago, for example, we discussed Mastodon. I was like, okay, what? now I actually discovered, and this was something that I have actually discussed with several experts from Ukraine a couple of weeks ago in Brussels, that, for example, Ukraine Forum is on Mastodon now, not Suspilne. Although we had Maria Frey with us discussing actually why not? Why don't we start at least putting it, follow us on this, and looking into, not necessarily Mastodon, there are also Blue Sky and others, So, but this is basically something that you own your own content, you own your advertisements, you own everything, and you work for yourself, not for the big tech.
You're not a product.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's basically something that's why I brought this up also. So for create more awareness in Europe and beyond about that.
Do we have? Yes, we have more questions.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Yevhen, for spending an evening with us, and thanks to Ukraine House for being the host today. Ellen Christensen, I'm working with anti-corruption in Ukraine, so allow me to go back to the corruption issue again. When we meet with our partners and civil society activists in Ukraine and talk about the fight against corruption and Ukraine's future, I think we feel that there's like a changing narrative now in Ukraine, where in the past it was very, absolute term, no tolerance for corruption. And somehow now fighting corruption is seen more as something that can add to a public good like security or humanitarian support. So it becomes more like a relative term to achieve something else. How do you look at that? And who could somehow be the driving force behind that kind of development?
If there are no checks and balances installed, any activity can go to the extreme and can lose its mission along the way. The way many anti-corruption procedures have been implemented in Ukraine ended up with the punitive mode of declarations. There are deviations along the entire system. For instance, if you are a public person, no bank will want to open an account for you, because the regulations for the banks is so sophisticated and requires so much control and is so expensive that it's easier for the bank to just kick you out from their client list. What it resulted in is that good people do not consider going for the state service because they don't want to put themselves and their loved ones through the hassle. Because it's not only you becoming the public person, it's everyone that you are living with in the household. So your kids, your wife, your mother are the subject to the same regulation. This has been an extreme case of very unsmart and unbalanced approach. I have myself produced with two other well-known Ukrainian sociologists and a institutional economist a paper on change of mode in communicating corruption, so it doesn't become basically, well, you know what we lost? We lost the presumption of innocence with corruption. It's enough that you're tainted with suspicion that there are real legal consequences that happen. If you are, for instance, listed because of someone's mistake as a person who has been corrupt in an official database, you cannot be taken out of this database. As a result, becoming part of this database has become part of the government blackmail. The government would take the opposition figures, or it would take the leaders that they didn't like and put them through anti-corruption trial just to get them into the database. This ruins, for instance, careers for potential corporate CEOs who will never again will be on C-level in any international firm, because the suspicion is enough. And this was part of, I think this was part of big geopolitical game where we were not old enough, we were not mature enough to understand it. Barack Obama designated Joe Biden as his Ukraine person in 2014. The American interest was not to get involved militarily. So the question was, what's going to be the main theme of the US? And I would say many Europeans followed the US leadership in agenda setting for the civil society in Ukraine. At that time, there were two schools of thought in the civil society. The school of thought that I belonged to said that security is issue number one. It's the most important issue. The USAID and their partner organizations were saying that corruption is the problem. I agree, corruption is the problem. No doubt about it. The question is, what's the best way to fight corruption? From my point of view, it's security. It's enhancing security. What we ended up with is greater infrastructure on the side of inevitability of punishment, but not on the side of making the system fair. So corruption, the fight with corruption has become a tool of political persecution, and it has become the tool of selective punishment, as the former heads of anti-corruption bureaus have learned themselves on their own skin. The president and the other political decision makers, their greatest fear is not, and this is the reason why they're trying to re-elect and why they don't build smart exit strategies, is not that they will be punished for something, but that their lives will be made miserable by constant procedural persecution post position, when they relieve the position. Let me give you an example with public service broadcast. The new person, someone who had no background before, was not exposed in any way, was elected as head of public service broadcast. He had criminal investigations against him in 3 months. These criminal investigations had no essence. They were just to put the message through that, look, you're vulnerable. You plan to go for a weekend? We will call you for questioning that day. You want to do something? We will change your plans. The retired one is, I think he's out of his position for 5 years now. He still has pending criminal cases against him, not because he did anything wrong. So what we did is we took the post-Stalinist system and we gave it extra powers before making it fair, which in some cases improved the situation. It rose the bar for potential punishment for corruption, etc. But it made the life of an honest state servant unbearable. The state servant is a person who is in constant stress that you're going to be punished for something that is your regular daily activities. And this gap is so huge that even former Canadian ambassador, Roman Vashchuk, who was used to be ambassador of Canada in Ukraine, he stood up against it and started speaking out. And again, a lot of people who were part of this system, they're not going to be living in a society that has to deal with the consequences. So, there is an outcry internationally. There is a lot of outcry in Ukraine, but there's little outcry internationally. In the end, it's not anti-corruption that defeated oligarchy in Ukraine. In the end, it turned out that these very anti-corruption activities have produced the part of the civil society that is always on the accusing side. I'm not, I'm joking sometimes that we don't have investigative journalism anymore. We have condemning journalism, And part of this is with the business models that, for instance, the donors brought in. If the donors are bringing you the model under which a editorial office has to produce one investigation per week, no matter what, it has to be aired Friday, 9 p.m. You have it, you don't have it, you have to air something. You know what they end up doing? Fake stuff. And from the point of view of the donor, it was all right because, it's not the mission that counts. It's your own performance that counts because you're going to be reviewed eventually. So Ukraine has become the litmus test whether we are actually following the mission of our intended activities, or we're producing zombie governance, where the mission is somewhere thrown out of the window, but we're actually as zombies. We just continue to do things, and we continue to talk the right things. So, I'm sorry for a lot of problems that are happening now, because now a lot of honest people who have dedicated their life to fight corruption have to apologize in a good company, saying that I'm coming from the anti-corruption environment, because instantly they're attacked by the casualties, that come from all sides. So this is anti-corruption motion in Ukraine was not done right and has to be reviewed and restarted from the beginning. The last thing that I will tell you is I talk through the university where I teach, Ukrainian Catholic University. I talk to the Supreme Court judges. Not that all of them are angels, quite the opposite. But what they are confessing to me during coffee breaks is that they, the judges of the Supreme Court, are now wondering where the end of where the authority of one anti-corruption institution ends and the other starts. Because we've taken the American model of the anti-corruption institutions, and there are lots of them. And you don't really understand which one of them steps in where. The public doesn't understand it. The lawyers don't understand it. The judges don't understand it. Hell, we've created a monster. So I support the motion. I understand that this is needed, but this is a result of a big political mistake, or let's call it a mistake. Okay, let's not go into accusations. But as a result, the corruption is defeated through not necessarily these tools, but also the other tools. I'm not saying that it's not working. It does work. It does bring results, but it has the side effects that you would not bear them in your home countries. You would not agree to live in a society with such side effects.
Thank you. Thank you. I do want to invite you still to maybe continue a little bit informally for a few minutes after the discussion. But first of all, I want to thank you for your attention and for coming to this talk. Grateful to Yevhen. We spoke at the Lviv Media Forum, where we both spoke a month ago, and felt that it would be great to have this chat about the intricacies of Ukrainian civil society that are often very much overlooked, I think, amongst our partners. So I'm really grateful that it happened. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank the team of Ukraine House. I'm going to Ukraine tomorrow, and this is the last public event that we're going to have in the first part of this year. So I want to thank Tanya and Valeria and Katerina and Daria, and I know Alina was back there, and all of the team of volunteers of Ukraine House who have done dynamic lineup of programming that we had in this first part of the year. We will continue on. Katerina, our curator, is working on a large-scale exhibition of Ukrainian art in Danish collections, which we'll be presenting towards the Independence Day of Ukraine. So look for our invitations. I hope you're all on our newsletters and you're getting our notifications. We're always really happy to see you here and to make sure that Ukrainians' points of views are heard. It's for our security and our common security. So thank you so much again for coming, and thank you, Yevhen.
Thank you very much.